Hello there, my name is Ren, and I am here to talk to you about being wrong. If you're already subscribed to this channel, it's probably because of my old Sims videos and story videos that I used to do in middle school, but I don't do those anymore. I think I've outgrown them at this point, but I hope that you will stick around anyways. I'm obviously not new to YouTube, but I kind of wanted to restart this channel to be a separate space to express myself and focus on personal growth and how that process intersects with my politics and how they change over time. So for my first video, I want to talk to you a little bit about being wrong, because it happens to me. Like a lot. And it will also happen to you. Yes, you, the person sitting there watching this. Hi, you're probably wrong about things. If you were to do an inventory of your beliefs and your opinions, you really are probably wrong about quite a few things right now. But don't worry, again, I am too. Humans aren't magical and omniscient. We're always in the process of learning, and we don't really know what we don't know, right? It's not your responsibility or anyone else's to know everything. But if you don't look back on yourself from several months ago and cringe at least a little bit, you probably aren't growing enough, which means you probably aren't being critical enough of your own positions. I do want to be precise here, though, because I think a lot of people know when they're crossing a line beyond normal misconceptions into behavior that's extremely harmful or dangerous, especially if it's directed at marginalized people, and that's not what I'm talking about here. While misconceptions and biases can still do serious harm, and I do not want to understate that, I'm not really focusing this video on things that are malicious or intentional. Rather, I want to focus on the instincts that encourage defensiveness and how they're holding us back. And also some potential ways to overcome those defensive feelings during interactions with other people. One small study from the University of Southern California indicated that people associate their political identities with their personal identities, which is why an attack on someone's political beliefs is often perceived as an attack on the self. This is one possible explanation for why so many people double down on politicized arguments, even when they're confronted with factual or seemingly objective information that is incongruous with their beliefs. People have a much easier time accepting neutral information counter to their assumptions when their beliefs aren't closely or personally tied to their identity. For example, it's easier for people to accept that George Washington's teeth were made of wood or animal teeth than it is for them to accept that at least one set of his teeth very likely included teeth extracted from enslaved people. One argument is just an interesting fact. The emotional impact is fairly neutral. The other explicitly challenges the virtue of a figure that many Americans, especially on the right, view with a substantial amount of reverence. You're going to get a lot more backlash from the second statement simply because it presses up much more closely against personally held beliefs about the history of the country. And there's a sense of discomfort at the idea that you've been lied to or that you've enabled something horrible as a result. And there's also a fear of the implicit domino effect of accepting the truth. If they lied to you about this, what else did they lie to you about? And no one likes to feel like a bad person or they're the villain in other people's stories, right? Everyone sees themselves as the main character, the protagonist. So there's almost a kind of trauma, for lack of a better word, involved in unlearning and unpacking all of the propaganda that we've been taught and in many ways are still being spoon-fed every day from numerous sources. Part of why I bring this up is because of how this impacts educating or attempting to educate other people and persuading them to accept new information. You cannot force someone to change their beliefs, no matter how harmful or objectively wrong they are. This doesn't only apply to the right either. It's true of a lot of interactions with liberals or among leftists. As much as we want to, we can't force people to change their positions. But what we can do is give them the tools and hope that they do it themselves, and we can make the social cost of failing to do so sting a little bit. I'm going to use myself as an example here. I grew up in a leftist household, but for a number of reasons, I still had a ton of unlearning to do, and obviously, I still do. The first time I really encountered the backlash effect in myself was in a class in university called Belonging in America. The class was focused around a critical assessment of American history and social norms through an intersectional lens. Intersectionality is the idea that people come from many different overlapping identities that can impact how they move through the world and how they interact with systems, and how those systems perceive them. For example, my experience as a white, middle-class, non-binary, bisexual, disabled person is not the same as the experience of a cisgendered black woman, or a disabled trans man, or an able-bodied sex worker. There are different axes of privilege and oppression that overlap in everyone's stories. It's not a contest. As someone who grew up a fledgling leftist surrounded almost entirely by conservatives outside my household, I really hadn't been exposed to these ideas before. And while I was initially pretty receptive, the backlash hit for me on two major subjects: white privilege and the idea that gender is a social construct. So, obviously, I'm white, like, so white, like aggressively unseasoned Caucasian. With white privilege, my backlash came from a place of discomfort with reckoning with the idea that I hadn't necessarily earned everything that I have, and that there were implicit systems benefiting me and giving me advantages my whole life. For example, I had untreated ADHD in K through 12. There were several disciplinary incidents that probably would have escalated a lot more severely if I hadn't been white. And I may make a video about the school-to-prison pipeline to elaborate a little bit more on what I'm talking about here. Additionally, it required me to acknowledge blind spots, microaggressions, racist stereotyping, and biases that I wasn't even really consciously aware of. All of this challenged and even shattered the image I had of myself as good person, TM. As someone who knew what was right and just, you know? It also put me in the position of listening and realizing that my voice wasn't always the most important. And as an outspoken and even, I like to think, gregarious person, the idea that my voice isn't always a worthy contribution hurts a little bit. You know, it's kind of painful. It took me a couple of years to work through and understand white privilege. There were some backslides. It took a lot of people gently or not so gently correcting me for me to realize just how much work I still had to do. And to clarify, there's not any time in my life that I would have called myself racist. But looking back, I definitely did and said some racist things without realizing it. I don't feel guilty exactly, at least not about my whiteness or what my ancestors did or whatever. I'm not responsible for that beyond acknowledging what happened and trying to dismantle any lasting effects. Where I feel guilty is where I've personally perpetuated systemic racism, or when I know I committed a microaggression against someone. Those moments live in my anxiety brain rent-free anytime I'm lying awake at night. When it comes to white privilege, there was a time that I was on the ignorant side of the conversation, and working through that involved a lot of painful introspection. I also want to take a moment to stress that in talking about this, I'm not at all saying the feelings of white people or other dominant groups should be prioritized in this discussion. The work I'm talking about here is mostly internal. It does not involve centering your feelings in shared spaces of discussion. Admittedly, that experience was not as painful as the introspection I would go through surrounding gender. This one was rough for me. I grew up a feminist. My mom was always a strong, independent woman and raised me vocally with those values. I had a vague understanding that transgender people existed, although at the time I don't think I called them that, and it made sense to me that some people could be born in the wrong body and took steps to make it right. Cool. But I didn't understand anything as nuanced as the performative nature of gender, or the idea that you could be anything other than a man or a woman, or that gender isn't something fixed and inherent, or even the same across cultures. For most of my life, I identified pretty strongly as a woman, despite occasionally dabbling in the masculine aesthetic, playing male role-playing characters or wanting to be the husband when I played house as kids. Despite identifying strongly as a woman, partially because my mom really encouraged and fostered that identity, part of me always felt uncomfortable, like I was failing at femininity. When my professor taught us that gender is a social construct and that you aren't necessarily a man or a woman just because you're born with one set of genitals, and that the roles of men and women look different across culture and time, and that some cultures already recognized additional genders, I got really upset. I almost considered dropping the class because I found the idea just so totally outrageous. Like, the fact that you were either a man or a woman, and for the most part had corresponding genitals to match, was such an inescapable and thoroughly entrenched part of my reality. And I was so attached to my identity as a woman and as a feminist that I really did feel like my world was being turned upside down, because I think I knew that meant the feelings that I had were a lot more complicated than I had hoped. And this took me years to work through. And a big part of it was accepting the reality that I am genderqueer or gender fluid or non-binary, whatever you want to call it. Basically, I'm not strictly a woman and I may not be one at all. And it turned out that a lot of the anxiety I had about living up to femininity was dysphoria. The reason I didn't feel comfortable in my skin was because the version of myself that I was trying to sell the outside world was what I thought they wanted in terms of feminine presentation, not how I felt most comfortable. And obviously, I still enjoy indulging in femininity, but my relationship with it's changed. And getting to the place I am now with a more nuanced understanding I have of gender and my own relationship to it, it was a long, painful process. And it's a journey that I'm still on. I was wrong about gender, and my incorrect assumptions caused me to inadvertently hurt a lot of people's feelings along the way. They caused me to try to force myself to be something I wasn't, so I ended up hurting myself. And in many ways, they caused me to innate harmful power structures. Unlearning my misconceptions about gender seriously did improve my quality of life, but when I was introduced to the idea, I just wasn't ready for it. No amount of telling me that I was wrong would have instantly changed my mind. Under different circumstances, with different influences, I genuinely worry that I could have ended up a TERF, because I think that's actually a substantial factor in the place a lot of these TERF attitudes come from. So what actually worked to change my views was a combination of things. After my initial backlash, I kept being exposed to the conversations in other places, on social media, in popular culture, among friends, and I became more familiar with language. When I expressed incorrect understanding, my friends would correct me. And because we have a good relationship, they generally do so respectfully, but that's also because I was respectful to them. The more people I respected were telling me, hey, you're wrong about this, the more I reflected on the ideas that they were challenging. And I eventually got to the point where I was able to be receptive to the studies and the articles and the books and the think pieces and the video essays that could help me understand. This is similar to how the process went with white privilege, how it went with unlearning class biases I didn't even know I had, internalized ableism, my earring, and also some really uncool body shaming of men that I used to participate in. Every time I thought that I had finally arrived at being a correct, good person who has it all figured out, I kept finding out I had more to learn, and I'm sure there will be backlash to subjects and issues in the future that cause me to reckon with all of this again and again. But coming out the other side is always a lot more fulfilling. And being wrong in the first place isn't shameful. Humans have to be taught everything from how to use a spoon to how to wipe our bums and tie a shoe. So I don't know how we really expect anyone to just know the complex nuances of our varied social hierarchies containing literal billions of unique experiences. So no, there's no shame in being wrong, especially if you grew up surrounded by and steeped in propaganda. However, once the tools to correct your position are available to you, I do think it's a bit more shameful to double down, but it is also human. So having been on both sides of this, and based on my anecdotal experience, here are some things that can help when a person is experiencing backlash. They will not always work, and they won't even work most of the time. You're really not going to change people's minds if they don't want to change. But these are methods I use to try and soften the backlash and encourage people to be a little bit more open. I'm going to frame these around arguing with conservatives because although this is obviously an issue leftists and centrists have as well, I do think there are fewer cultural impediments to encouraging them to at least listen to your position. So first, although I'm not and never have been right-wing, a lot of misconceptions I've personally had do overlap with the conservative misconceptions and stereotypes. Personally, because I was raised in a conservative area and because my leftist parents were not immune to bias or the impact of living in that area either, and partially because all humans, leftists included, have biases and blind spots and need to actively work on them. I usually start a critique of someone's position by saying, hey, I used to believe something similar. Here's what made me reconsider. Then I link a source, usually a study or an article. After this point, I'm ready to leave the interaction at any time. I don't engage with attacks on my person or character, and if they get too aggressive, I won't hesitate to leave the conversation and say that their failure to be respectful is why. And I'm especially firm on this if the conversation is in a public forum where other people can see. If someone tries to claim there's an issue with my sources, which happens quite often, I ask them to tell me which sources they will accept, and then I will try to find corroborating information from those sources. Otherwise, I just don't engage in source battles, because when I ask people what sources they'll accept, they usually don't have any, because they don't actually want the information. So they're looking for any excuse to prevent me from giving it to them. And even if there is personal accountability that a person needs to take, rather than focusing on that, I do try to anchor the conversation a little bit more in something that's more relatable. A lot of the breakthroughs, at least for me, where I was able to get past my initial backlash and evolve on issues, was realizing that they affected real people, often people I cared about, and humanizing the issue when possible gives a person something to connect to besides their own feelings of backlash or shame or embarrassment. And you can either, describe your own experiences or use any numbers of analogies, anecdotes, etc. to get the point across. But basically, you're just trying to get one emotion to sort of overwhelm the other one. To emphasize, I don't think I've ever changed a person's mind in one conversation. Like, there are maybe a few people I might have, nudged slightly, if I'm being really optimistic. But the main purpose of engaging and doing so in the way that I do is to give the person something to chew on later, even if they aren't ready to act on it now. So set realistic goals for your interactions to avoid disappointment and burnout. And even if you don't change the mind of the person that you're discussing with, if other people can see the conversation and see the points you made and how they were responded to, there's always a chance that you'll nudge someone else in the right direction, even if they didn't actually participate in the interaction. A big part of diffusing backlash in my experience, even if someone isn't ready to agree with you, is to let them know that you aren't inherently better or smarter than them. I think that's a pretty substantial source of the backlash, is basically the feeling that the person who's trying to correct you now thinks that you are not intelligent or not worthy or that you're a bad person. And so trying to get away from encouraging those kinds of feelings in people can help. I am not inherently better or smarter than someone else because I knew something that they didn't. Making the person in the wrong feel like their mistake is something they can move past and recover from is important to encouraging them into the introspection that's necessary to see how they came to have that understanding or make that mistake and how they can be better in the future. Another important note, none of this applies to or white supremacists or QAnon cultists or trolls. You're welcome to engage with them in good faith, for show or out of principle or a twisted sense of self-hatred. Same. But know that there's no sincerity in their engagement, and they're generally going to spend the time bullying and belittling you. Basically trying to bait you so that you will insult them, and then they can scream argumentum ad hominem and dismiss and invalidate all of your arguments while playing the victim and antagonizing you. It's worth it to challenge them in a public forum, if only to ensure that they are challenged. But don't get too invested, and once you've said your piece, don't be afraid to leave, and be liberal with that block button. That is the only time it is good to be liberal. The fewer of these people with access to you in any way, the better. I do also want to emphasize that it is not the duty of any marginalized person to educate people when they don't want to. And if, instead of trying to educate people, you just want to dunk on the racists or homophobes or transphobes or ableists or whatever, all right. That is totally okay and reasonable. You are allowed to do that. You don't owe anyone your time or your labor. This isn't any kind of argument to tone police yourself or subject yourself to people's bad takes or abuse. And it's especially not an argument to tone police other marginalized people. But if it's a person you care about, who you are really invested in and want to encourage to question their harmful ideas, like maybe a family member, vocally coming from a place of humility, acknowledging your own flaws and misconceptions in the same area and what led you to overcome them, and suggesting resources they can dig into are good strategies to introduce them to the process of growth and introspection. Unfortunately, all you can really do is try as many different ways as you can think of to get them to initiate the process, but this isn't something you can effectively force someone through. And that's a painful realization in and of itself, right? You can only meet people where they're at. Finally, if you think this video doesn't apply to you, that you have no blind spots, or you never had any kinds of harmful views, I would encourage you to go back and read through old posts you've shared or written in the past few years. If you've made content or videos like I have, watch them. It's illuminating. It might surprise you. Seeing your past self and realizing how many things you were wrong about and how much you've changed is both really jarring, but also kind of comforting. And it's worth the cringe. And while we're working on helping pull people in the right, or ideally left, direction, there's still lots of other things we can do, like cyberbullying our representatives and elected officials into supporting more equitable policies, taking to the streets, donating to causes and mutual aid, organizing, demanding more representation, elevating the voices of marginalized people who are sharing their experiences and the voices of folks trying to educate. There's so much other work to do while we're waiting for people to evolve their position. It's a lot easier to move through life with an attitude of acceptance that you'll make mistakes and self-forgiveness when it happens, and a good helping of grace for other people when they demonstrate that they are trying. That is important. They have to be trying. Being wrong's okay. We're all wrong sometimes. And it doesn't mean you aren't smart or that you're a bad person. But we all have to want to be better. Okay, that's all I've got for you. I know that was a little bit rough and rambly, but if you stuck with me, I appreciate you. If you're already subscribed, sorry for the ambush. Everyone else, please subscribe if you would like to see more of this content. And thank you for letting me into your world for a little bit to talk to you. See you next time.